We saw the same problems, whether it was the Department of Defense or the Fortune 500 customers or startups just not having access to the right skill sets and talent for an affordable price and not being able to maintain and continue to build on these DevOps capabilities.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 173, Drag and Drop Deployments for Kubernetes with Harpoon. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, we talk about low code more and more these days, and it just makes me feel sad.
Why? What's sad about it?
Well, I mean, we like to think that we're real programmers, and all of a sudden we have HR people writing more lines of code than we are.
Yeah, but isn't that actually what real programmers do? Solve real problems instead of doing over and over the same thing, I'm doing today what I did yesterday, what I did the day before, and so on and so forth. So if by real programmer you mean a person who is writing getter setters, then I don't think that there is space for those.
Okay. So on today's episode, we have a guest on with us. We have Dom Holt from Harpoon. Dom, how you doing?
Great. It's really great to take some time and chat with you guys, and I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
Now, Harpoon, the tagline on their site, deploy software with no-code Kubernetes. I never thought in my life I would ever see no-code and Kubernetes in the same sentence, much less right beside each other. What's up with this process with Harpoon?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's just the natural evolution of software and technology, Darren, right? If, 10, 20 years ago, I told you I was going to deploy my software in the cloud, you probably would say something like, "Oh, I'm not sure that's a good idea, Dom. You probably need to build a data center to be more secure and you'll be more in control, and if I showed up tomorrow to your house and said I'm going to start building a data center next door so I can deploy some software, you'd probably look at me like I was a crazy person. So you just have these different layers of abstraction that developers can build on top of over time. And why handle all that complexity yourself if there's a service or capability that can do it for you, as long as it's affordable and it makes sense. We'll probably get into this in a little bit, but me and my team have been consulting and doing DevOps work for the better part of a decade, working with the US government, Fortune 500 companies, startups, pretty much everybody. And we just saw a real need here for simplifying the complexity of container orchestration and Kubernetes. And so we decided to build it.
So Harpoon came out of scratching your own itch for your consulting gigs.
Yeah, we definitely built high quality deployment scripts, very custom use cases for different clients. But at the end of the day, when you transition those scripts to the clients themselves, we saw the same problems, whether it was the Department of Defense or the Fortune 500 customers or startups just not having access to the right skill sets and talent for an affordable price and not being able to maintain and, continue to build on these DevOps capabilities.
So where does that stand on a scale? So if I put two extremes, at least that we have today, one extreme would be, hey, I'm a person who actually creates Kubernetes with kubeadm and go into all the details possible, right? And if I define the other extreme as Kubernetes is more or less invisible to you because you're using something like Google Cloud Run or Azure Container Apps or Fly.io or Heroku, even though Heroku is not Kubernetes. Where do you stand there on that spectrum? Or is it outside of that spectrum?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think definitely we have some constructs for Kubernetes that are built into Harpoon as visual elements. But at the end of the day, if you're using Harpoon, we've developed it from a UX perspective such that you really shouldn't have to know that you're using Kubernetes. You just need to know that your software is deployed successfully and that you can scale up your software and configure it and modify it and do all the things you would normally want to do in a production software environment without having to write any code or any YAML or configuration. It's all dynamically deployed.
And so how does it look like? Do I say I want to run a front-end application Kubernetes? Or does it look like I want to create a deployment in Kubernetes? How does it look like? I mean, it's hard to visualize it. We're not having a screen here, but...
For sure. I mean, I think definitely encourage people to go check it out and play around with it. There's a free version, but at the end of the day, Harpoon is, as far as we know, the first capability that can dynamically deploy any software on top of Kubernetes, and all of the YAML and the scripts are dynamically generated. So we just do integrations with typical places where people might have their software. So we have an integration, you can search Docker Hub. So maybe you want a database like MongoDB, you can just type in Mongo and drag it onto a workspace. If you have a GitHub repository, we've integrated with GitHub, so you can search for GitHub repositories and you can drag those onto the screen. And Harpoon will dynamically build your software for you and deploy it to Kubernetes just with a couple of button clicks. We do the same things with private container registries. We have integrations with private container registries. So if you have your own container registry with your own container images you've built, like ECR or Harbor, we can just search those and drag and drop them on the screen as well.
But how do you establish kind of variations depending on what I need? I'm guessing front-end and back-end application is not the same. One is exposed to the public, another one is not. Do I have some kind of a catalog? I mean, outside of databases, third parties and stuff like that. Is there some kind of catalog of types of application? Is that defined by you? Is that defined by ops in my company? How do you kind of tackle that issue?
I think you bring up a good point, Victor. A lot of the tools in this space have sort of really banked on providing a curated catalog of capabilities to their clients. And the reason for that, obviously, is because it's easier, right? Like if I have written the deployment scripts for, these 10 front-end capabilities and these 10 back-end capabilities, I know they're going to work every time because I wrote them myself. And, if you click the button, it's just going to deploy the script that I wrote that now you're using. Harpoon isn't like that. Harpoon is dynamically deploying software. So I can find random things on Docker Hub, or I can find, somebody's custom GitHub repository through searches, as long as you connect your account. And it's dynamically writing the YAML and deploying those things into Kubernetes, so it works for pretty much anything. But you bring another good point is sort of what is the typical workflow. So one is finding the software you want to deploy and getting it onto the screen and deployed, period, in Kubernetes. The other is going through what you have to do to make that software accessible or resilient, using some of the more Kubernetes-based elements. So if you deployed some piece of software, let's say you had a front-end GitHub repository for your UI for your software, and you dragged and dropped that onto Harpoon, and you clicked build and deploy, you'd have your front end running inside of a production grade Kubernetes cluster, which is great, but nobody would be able to access it, right? Because by default, Kubernetes locks everything to the outside world for security reasons. So we have Kubernetes constructs like ingress routes, secrets management, config maps, persistent volume claims, and you just drag and drop those elements as well and attach them to what is then your pod, basically your visual reference to your pod. And you can open up ports and create DNS routes and attach persistent volume claims all dynamically to all of the pods in your cluster.
Okay, so it's pretty much like following Kubernetes logic, right? You don't have opinionated kind of this is an application or two models of application or whatever. You're basically allowing me to assemble different Kubernetes resources in a visual way. Config map, deployment, stateful set, service mesh, what's not, right? So it's kind of like in a way a catalog of Kubernetes resource definitions? Kind of, I mean, a user will not know what is the kind of, but kind of for those who are deeper into Kubernetes, is it a catalog of CRDs in a way?
Yeah, I mean it's really just base level Kubernetes capabilities that you might find in the Kubernetes API, or you might execute through the CLI if you're using kube control, right? So I think the best way to think about Harpoon is that it is Kubernetes, right? But it's just completely done through visual cues versus writing a bunch of hand jammed YAML.
Nice.
So nice UI, drag and drop, but can I drive it by any kind of configuration? Like, is there some sort of round trip to where I can do configuration as code?
Yeah, so today, like certainly everybody has environment variables and things in their code or secrets. A lot of people, unfortunately, hard code those into the backend services and things like that. And we wanted to make it really easy to do the right thing and to make software deployments really easy. So again, utilizing some of the Kubernetes functions, you can just attach those config maps and those secrets as key value pairs to your custom software, to any of the software you find in a container registry. And then Harpoon will automatically pick up any changes you do and modify your deployment descriptor YAMLs, create, new use cases for, config maps or volumes that have to live inside the cluster, and then do all the attachments dynamically. So again, it's all really just drag and drop, maybe entering a port here and there or a directory you want to sync in a persistent volume claim. But, we're talking about seconds of work versus principal level software developers sitting at their desk and banging their head on the wall for a few hours, wondering why they don't have a tab in the right place or why their deployment descriptor is not working how they want it to.
So all of this sounds great for day zero type stuff, but what about day two?
Well, I think a lot of the investment in Kubernetes, making Kubernetes easier, because there's a lot of people trying to make Kubernetes easier right now because it's so prevalent in industry, has been on day zero and maybe some on day one, where it's like, well, I'll make it easier to deploy your Kubernetes cluster. I'm going to use EKS or AKS, and I'm just going to go through a wizard or whatever and stand up my Kubernetes cluster, so I don't necessarily have to go through that pain anymore. And then, day one is really like, how do I get, it's not very useful to have an empty Kubernetes cluster, so how do I get my software deployed and running? I think Harpoon really shines on day one because we've greatly accelerated people's ability to get their software running on a very expedient timeline. But then we're also kind of living in day two and beyond. It's like, well, what if I have to change the configuration for a pod? Or what if I have to scale up the cluster? Or, what if I want to see if the pod goes down? What's the status of the pod? And so all of those things are also baked into Harpoon so that you can get a real-time status using colors and logs of all the different pods and services that are running inside your cluster. We are currently building in like blue-green deployments and automated rollbacks in case you deploy something and it doesn't quite work and you want to keep your production software running. So I think Harpoon is one of the first examples I've seen of something that encapsulates day zero, day one, and day two as, encompassed capability, and we're always adding more capabilities onto it as well.
Well, what would be the requirements? Can I just bring my own cluster, whatever the cluster is, or it needs to be specific type?
I think Harpoon right now is in beta, and that's a bit of a dirty word, right? Because I think it implies that there's still a bunch of bugs in the system, right? And so for us, beta was a different type of milestone where we knew people were going to be using the software to deploy their production workloads. And so there wasn't going to be a case where we could just stick this software out on the internet with a bunch of bugs in it and, hope for the best. We're like, well, people figure it out. So our beta was really more We had a closed beta for about a year and a half where we were working with different customers to sort of iron out all of those things. And now that we're in open beta, our open beta milestone was really like, okay, it has to work 10 times out of 10 when people are deploying their software. It has to be a very resilient and solid system. So, that's what I mean when I say beta. Sorry, Victor, I went off on a tangent there. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, kind of. Is there some requirement? Can I just use it in any Kubernetes cluster? Or there are certain requirements? Like, for example, if let's say, I see very clearly how that can work very well with smaller companies like startups and stuff like that, right? No ops type of people. But does it work beyond that? Conceptually, at least, I know it's beta, kind of a lot of things to come. Can I just put my cluster and say, hey, okay, so here we use Linkerd, you will figure it out and kind of figure out how to connect my applications that I'm deploying by drag and drop using service mesh. I'm using service mesh as an example, but so does it have to be a fresh cluster with certain requirements, or can be any cluster in a way?
Yeah, so today in the open beta, when you click a button, we'll deploy a K3s cluster by default into either your AWS account if you're using AWS, or we also have an on-prem version of the tool that you can use that runs on top of VMware. But Harpoon is actually highly modular because we use the Kubernetes API under the covers. So it's actually feasible to switch out the UI portion with any variant of Kubernetes. So you can switch out to OpenShift or, upstream Kubernetes or, anything else that you'd like, EKS, AKS. It works exactly the same way.
That's very, very impressive. So kind of if I would switch to OpenShift, then the Harpoon itself would figure it out and start creating routes instead of ingresses, right?
Yep. And then you mentioned service mesh, so I'll bring it up. Like Harpoon actually is also a service mesh. So it's a Kubernetes with a service mesh tied in. And that's how we do all of the routing inside of the cluster and opening ports and opening, services and linking things together.
What's the security model like? I mean, I imagine if I'm going in and pointing and clicking and doing things, there's got to be at least some sort of role-based access control there.
Yeah, I mean, we, except for our on-prem deployments, Harpoon is largely a hybrid SaaS application. So you're doing the management of your cluster through our, multi-tenant application. But at the end of the day, we're deploying to your AWS account or your cloud service provider account. So, it's really, we do, put some safeguards in place for all the infrastructure that we deploy, because when you click the button, we're not just standing up a Kubernetes cluster, we're standing up we're creating IAM roles for you. We're, standing up load balancers and other things you're going to need to be successful in standing up a Kubernetes cluster in general in your AWS account. And then we deploy the cluster on top of that. So we have a lot of security baked into the infrastructure as code we use when we deploy to your account. But ultimately, it's your account, right? So you're in charge of making sure that the account is secured. And ultimately, if you really wanted to open a port with an ingress route to your database directly to the internet, like Harpoon wouldn't stop you from doing that, but, it'd be ill-advised.
How is the on-prem solution different then?
Truthfully, they're not much different. It's really down at the infrastructure as a code level for the most part. We use a lot of the same best practice tools we always used when we were doing consulting for, all of our different clients, building out Kubernetes clusters and CI/CD pipelines and all kinds of other stuff. So we use Terraform and Ansible, right? And so we're just attaching to VMware-based cluster and then deploying your Kubernetes variant on top. And then Harpoon is just attaching to that Kubernetes and doing the same thing it normally does. Now, Harpoon on-prem does actually work in air-gapped environments too. So completely offline, no access to the internet. And for those situations, there are some capabilities that obviously are not going to work. Like if you want to search Docker Hub, you could not do that because there's no interconnection. Or if you wanted to attach your GitHub repository, you couldn't do that because GitHub's on the internet, right? So we're always adding more integration. So, GitLab is one that's on our near-term roadmap. Bitbucket, obviously, we're looking at deployment to other clouds. So it won't be too long before we'll meet, a large percentage of everybody's use cases. But there are very few differences between the multi-tenant version in the cloud and on-prem.
The sub question there was, can I run it air gapped? And when you said you'd worked with government and defense, it was like, he's got to be able to be air gapped.
Yeah, we have certainly been talking to some groups in the U.S. government. This is a pressing problem for them as well. Many people on my team have also done deployments in classified environments and very austere network environments. So some of that stuff was just second nature to us when we were designing the on-prem deployments.
The security question is one thing that I brought up, but let me go at it from a different angle. I've been given access to log into Harpoon, whatever that means, and I'm ready to go and create my app again, whatever that means. What levels are there as a user within Harpoon to create these things? Do I get like a project or a namespace? How does that work? Or workspace? What is it like?
So there's the ability to create multiple projects inside of Harpoon. Part of the magic of Harpoon is just marrying Kubernetes constructs to some sort of visual indicator. So projects are actually namespaces in Kubernetes. So each project represents a different namespace. I mean, if you're not super familiar with Kubernetes, sounds like you guys are pretty well versed, but namespaces are physically shared but logically isolated deployments in the cluster, right? So when you deploy a cluster, it's a shared cluster across the account, and then we just isolate by namespaces based on project. So if you wanted like a dev, staging, and prod environment, you could create that. You can even, when you create a project, you can make copy over an existing project if you wanted to go like have a ephemeral staging environment or something like that. But yeah, I mean, we mostly assume, at least at the moment, that you have like an administrative level capability when you're creating a Harpoon account, because if you have the ability to link your AWS account and your GitHub account, then you probably have pretty high level access. But ultimately, as we get more and more involved with a lot more enterprise clients, we'll probably add some single sign-on capabilities and some more role-based access control, is I'm guessing what you're hinting at.
You mentioned earlier that, if I understood right, Harpoon users, apart from managing their own applications, can manage some third-party applications like databases and so on and so forth, right? And significant number, ever-increasing number of those third-party applications are based somehow on custom resources and controllers and operators and what's not, right? Which are all cluster-level resources. And I'm asking this mostly because I don't have the answer outside of Harpoon either. If users are working within a project, yet what they're doing is on a cluster level, how do you prevent people overwriting each other?
Yeah, I mean, all the deployments are separate. So you could have multiple instances of the same container image running if you wanted to. It would just create a separate pod deployment or service deployment.
But that's kind of for your applications that I understand completely. But you mentioned third-party applications, right? If you I don't know, deploy MongoDB or something like that, it's going to be based on custom resources and operators that are cluster level. So we're not talking about namespace resources anymore, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think a normal use case we run into a lot is just Helm charts, right? You've already configured all this stuff to work as a Helm chart. You have multiple services and resources that are running together. And to be fully open and transparent, Harpoon doesn't do Helm charts today, right? Like it's definitely on our roadmap, but we really have built out a core capability to do these deployments with Kubernetes. I think today it's more starting from scratch, right? Like if you're trying to adopt Kubernetes and you're trying to do it in a much easier way that, doesn't require specialized skill sets and a lot of time, I think Harpoon's a really good choice for that. We're constantly iterating on the feature set and the capabilities now that we do have that core capability set that works 10 times out of 10. What was really important for us as a team was to make sure that open beta was really solid. Like it just had a core feature set that enabled people to be successful for a lot of, mainstream use cases. As we continue to iterate and build out the feature set, we're going to add, some of those things that I think people are going to say are missing, right? Helm chart support, custom resource definitions, those type of things, so that they're all also drag and drop. We can even add in hybrid pod virtual machine deployments if you start adding in KubeVirt and some of those other features into the capabilities, and you could search Ansible Galaxy for virtual machines to deploy as well, right? So there isn't a limit, I think, for the amount of feature richness and robustness that we could build into the tool. Our goal to this point was to build a solid beta capability that met the need of a lot of different clients and that was modular, so we could easily build on top of it and integrate more features and capabilities. So that's kind of where we're at today.
I'm in the UI and I'm pointing and clicking and doing things. How does my boss audit what I've been doing? Is there some sort of audit trail that keeps track of who did what when?
Today, unfortunately, that's a really good idea, actually, but we haven't built any sort of event-sourced logging. It wouldn't be hard to do, but no, unfortunately, that doesn't exist today.
Again, open beta, getting it out and going. Would Harpoon stop me from doing something stupid, like deleting out a persistent volume underneath a database?
Yeah, I mean, at a base level, right? So we don't try to restrict you from doing a thing. Like one thing that's really jarring to me is if I go into the AWS console, like I don't want to beat up Amazon, but and I start trying to delete resources, and AWS will tell me some message saying like, it's being used by something else, so I can't delete it. And like even if I know what I'm doing and I really want to delete it, it's like no, and then you have to. It's kind of a cryptic message, so you have to sort of travel through different regions and different screens of managed services that you have in AWS. And sometimes it'd be quite difficult to figure out, like, what am I supposed to delete first? And then what do I delete next? And you got to type in stuff and you delete stuff. We don't go to that extreme. I think, before you delete any resource, we kind of give you a little dialogue or a pop-up, say, like, is that really what you want to do? Because we certainly won't want people to, like, accidentally misclick and destroy a persistent volume claim or something really important. So there's definitely some built-in capabilities in the tool that sort of stop you from at least doing the first level of oh god, I can't believe what I've done, type of problems. But after that, we pretty much leave it up to the user to decide what makes the most use case. And as we add in role-based access control or attribute-based access control, as the capability matures, maybe we'll apply roles and policies to different types of resources. But for today, there's a lot of trust placed in the user, but not so much that you could probably make an accident and delete something really important.
So once a person logs in, at least from a Harpoon level, they have a credential already within the cluster, I'm assuming. So how are you tying the Harpoon user back to the cluster user? Is it the same user?
The user is associated with the cluster. So that user has pretty much complete control of that particular cluster. And, it's up to them to decide whether to scale it up, what to deploy, what to open, those types of things. So I think typically what we'll find, we say we built Harpoon for the pizza guy. So should be able to order pizza and have them sit down at your laptop and successfully deploy some software to your Kubernetes cluster and get it up and running. But I mean, obviously that's not going to be the real use case. You probably have some software developers who may or may not be super familiar with Kubernetes that do understand how your software is laid out and what needs to be deployed and how to configure the environment variables and secrets and those types of things. And most likely you'll have, situations where you'll have these software developers who will just kind of drag and drop the things they need very quickly and get everything up and running in probably like 10 minutes or less. But we did want to make it easy enough to use so that if you were the startup, you say, and you're a business owner and maybe you used to had an outsourced dev team and you wanted to kind of handle the DevOps piece yourself, that it should be feasible for you as well.
So this takes us back to sort of the beginning when you were talking about abstractions. You want Harpoon to be that abstraction. Nobody really even knows that Kubernetes is under the hood. It's like, here's my block, here's the other block, I tie them together, have a nice day.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you know about Kubernetes and you look at Harpoon, you will say, this is Kubernetes, right? But if you don't, it should still be very possible for you to be successful using the tool.
Fast forward 24 months down the road, where's Harpoon at? No forward-looking statements, not putting you on that pressure, but where do you see it going?
No, I totally think that's a fair question. I mean, I think we're about to release our new UI, so it's a much more fancy, very streamlined UI. The original UI was designed by me late at night, probably between caffeine and whiskey sessions. So it is something that probably a 6-year-old could do a better job designing. Our new UI is designed by an actual, really accomplished designer. And so it is a much better experience. And so we're deploying that actually within the next few weeks. And so that's a really exciting time for us. As far as the next couple of years, we have a solid capability. So it's really just about building out those missing features that certain people are looking for. Just talking now, Darren, like you've given a great idea for a feature. And what's great is every time I give a demo of the capability, everybody's got an idea for another thing. So it's just about prioritizing them based on, the demand for certain features, building them out as fast as we can. But also, making sure we take the time to build out a feature that is always going to work perfectly and is easy to use and understand. So we try to take a lot of time and make sure we get that right the first time. So we're not just trying to build a very feature-rich capability that doesn't work particularly well. So some of the things that are on the roadmap, again, are sort of like webhooks and automations for blue-green deployments with tying into Git, adding in some of those other Git repositories like Bitbucket and GitLab, and then more and more automations as possible. So, doing more monitoring to make sure that as resourcing becomes constrained, we auto scale up your Kubernetes cluster to a specified limit, things like that. And ultimately, just to give you a taste, we're going to move into different deployment environments. So different cloud service providers, maybe some edge service providers, and providing even more on-prem options like bare metal deployments.
How much is all that your code, and how much do you rely on other projects? Like you mentioned, what was it, kernel deployments or AB or something like that, right? You said you're developing it. Is that kind of like, are you developing it from scratch or adopting others in the background, not in the front end, of course?
So Harpoon itself is a microservices architecture, and we run the production version of Harpoon using the same scripts that we use to deploy our customer software. So it's kind of an eat your own dog food sort of situation. So our product wouldn't work if the deployment scripts didn't work for our customers. As far as how much is open source software, how much is custom software, I think it's a healthy mix. I think most experienced good software developers are always thinking about trade-offs between, should I use this open source project? Should I use this commercial piece of software? Should I write it from scratch? Right. And so I think it's a healthy balance of how custom do I need this thing to be, and how do I need it to work, and how compliant and how maintainable do I want the software to be as third-party software updates. So as an example, it was there's a lot of different software involved because Harpoon itself is quite complex when you get under the covers. But the easiest example to talk about is probably the Kubernetes API. Like, we certainly could have written some sort of proprietary thing to interface with Kubernetes once we dynamically generate the YAML code. But we decided to use the Kubernetes API because, first of all, we knew it would be more solid when we were interfacing with Kubernetes. We knew that for future versions of Kubernetes, when we're updating the software regularly, we didn't want all of our software to break. And ultimately, it just creates a better user experience for our customers when they know that we can simply update some open source software very quickly and easily and still maintain pairability with whatever the latest Kubernetes cluster is without having to modify any of our code. So where it makes sense to write proprietary software because there just wasn't a thing that existed out there, then we did. And where it was possible to stand on the shoulders of, a lot of awesome projects in the CNCF and open source community, then we inherited them as it made sense.
Cool. All of Dom's information is down in the show notes. Dom, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Darren and Victor. It's really great to talk to you guys, and thanks for the opportunity to share our tool with the world.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.